Joining me is British political activist Chris Nineham. He is a founding member of the Stop the War Coalition, an advocacy group for peace and against interventionism. Chris was one of the organizers of the protest on 15th of February 2003, where masses of people poured into the streets, voicing their opposition against the invasion of Iraq. It has been claimed as the largest public demonstration in British history. He also served under former Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn. So Chris, you know, it's the 20th anniversary. We're 20 years on now from 9/11. We've had the war on terror, so much conflict. Could I just get your thoughts very briefly on this 20th anniversary of this terrible attack and everything that's happened since then?
I mean, I think both the attack itself, which was a tragedy, and the response from the West have been absolutely catastrophic. I mean, the world has changed in the last 20 years very, very profoundly. And that's mainly because the kind of response to 9/11 that was charted by the US administration under Bush has been catastrophically bad. Initially, of course, there was the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. We've seen how that turned out. There's a lot of discussion about it at the moment in the media, but the discussion hasn't really focused on the key question. The key question or the key issue is that the whole idea of invading a country in order to liberate it, to change it, to bring progress is a completely faulty one, and one that is bound to lead to disaster. And this is the thing that, you know, in all the commentary and all the discussions about Afghanistan, that the commentariat and the politicians and the military people and the experts basically haven't been able to face up to. And then you've had the subsequent invasion of Iraq, the bombing of Syria, the bombing of Libya. All of these things have been disastrous and devastating, created a series of failed states, created a huge amount of anger, created what is called a refugee crisis, and made the world a much more dangerous and volatile and difficult place. So it's been in terms of particularly Western foreign policy, it's been an absolutely catastrophic 20 years.
One of the things that I remember from when I was a kid, and this has always stayed in my memory, is the February 15th protest. You know, seeing millions of people from around the world, as you just mentioned, and especially in the UK, flooding the streets. If I'm not mistaken, you helped organize this protest, right? And so I wanted to ask you, what does it take to sustain a movement like that, to keep a sentiment of anti-war, anti-imperialism going in the public, and how important is it to have public opinion against the wars in the first place?
Well, I mean, there were a number of different elements to building the movement. First of all, it was trying to establish the broadest possible kind of coalition of forces, which meant getting, obviously, people from the left, campaigning hard to get the unions on board, which is something we managed to do. Most of the trade unions in Britain, starting with the more militant unions, but gradually kind of pushing outwards from that base. Crucially, the Muslim communities in Britain, we approached, sometimes they approached us. We worked very, very closely together with them, and that was very important in terms of even the first demonstration in November 2001. There was a large number of people from, you know, the Muslim communities in Britain on the demonstration, which was a very, very powerful statement. I think it had a big effect on people. We got school students started to get involved around Iraq. We had school student strikes. We had large contingents of students from the universities coming out on the demonstrations. We had, I think very importantly, we had the big demonstrations, but we also had lots of other actions taking place. And crucially, we had local groups. We set up local groups, anti-war groups, in pretty much every community we possibly could up and down the country. So you had a kind of national organization, but also you had local organization, and they kind of fed off each other and helped to create a strong dynamic. I think keeping the message very, very clear was important. We only had 3 or 4 slogans, really, you know, stop the war, don't attack Iraq. Freedom for Palestine was absolutely central. to the 2003 demonstration, and that also made a difference. Stop the racist backlash and defending civil liberties. Those were the slogans. Very, very short and sharp, and very, very clear. Very much centered against what our government and what the American government were doing. And I just think by having a kind of, you know, on that kind of basis, a very, very broad campaign, but still a radical campaign, you know, a very kind of clearly anti-government campaign, we did manage to mobilize on that kind of scale. And I think, obviously, we didn't manage to stop the war either in Afghanistan or Iraq, which was tragic and has had terrible consequences. But I think we were able to influence public opinion quite profoundly, and it led to a situation where in Britain, which is after all historically the colonial power that's had the biggest empire, you know, a brutal kind of a pioneer of modern empires, to have a situation where the majority of people are against war is a very, very important and precious thing. And I think it has had an impact on politics since then, even if not as much of an impact as we would have liked. It nevertheless has created this kind of pool of anti-war sentiment and potential mobilization that is very worrying for the government and for the military, and has actually had the effect of limiting their options. I mean, you know, now, and I think this is true in the US as well, now any government that is considering doing the kind of Iraq or Afghanistan option of putting tens of thousands of troops in the ground is going to think very, very carefully about doing that, because domestically it would be, I would say, political suicide. Obviously the situation could change, there could be other events, but short of actual cataclysmic events, I don't think they could do that anymore. And it's not enough, because they're fighting drone wars and proxy wars and fighting you know, massive bombing campaigns and so forth. We have to stop them as well. But we have made some progress. We have limited their options. We have pushed the warmongers back. And for me, that's very, very important.
You recently wrote an article, I think in the Morning Star, about the 20-year anniversary of 9/11, and you mentioned that, quote, supporters of the invasion claim that there were advances in the country under occupation, but that the facts suggest otherwise. Can you give us some examples of that?
Well, I mean, the two things that are commonly said by defenders of the war, apologists for the war in Afghanistan, are that there was a health service that was built up that was, you know, a massive improvement, and B, that women's lives have improved. And I think really fundamentally neither thing is true. I mean, Afghanistan spends 0.6% of its GDP on health, which is one of the lowest percentages anywhere in the world, and stands against an average in South Asia of 5%. So, I mean, health provision is absolutely diabolical in the country. That's the truth. And secondly, on the issue of advances for women, I think there were some advances for women in more middle class or elite circles in the cities. But in general, life for women in Afghanistan has been as bad, if not worse, as it has for everyone else. I mean, 240,000 people have been killed by the war, just, you know, to start with. But also the devastation of the infrastructure, the general violence and lawlessness in the country. All of these things have impacted massively on women's lives. And actually, if you look at the stats, the levels of literacy for women in Afghanistan are the worst anywhere in the world. Only 18% of women in Afghanistan are literate at this point, after this so-called progress. So I think, unfortunately, this is war propaganda. It was used at the time of the launch of the war, and it's now being used to desperately try and justify the unjustifiable, and to try and pretend that what has happened in Afghanistan was anything other than an absolute disaster. So, you know, I don't think we should allow the people who support the war to get away with this kind of nonsense. They also talk about economic progress. Look at the World Bank statistics, look at the UN statistics. There has been no economic progress in Afghanistan in the last 20 years. In fact, most indexes suggest that it's gone backwards, which is not surprising, because that's what happens when you bombard a country with you know, with a huge amount of munitions, and send troops rampaging through the streets of towns and cities. You know, this isn't a particularly sensible economic strategy.
How do you assess the role of the media in all this? Because, you know, it's one thing for politicians to repeat these lies. What about the media in Britain, in the US, and globally?
Well, I mean, I can't really talk about the media globally because I haven't been analysing it. But certainly in Britain, I think it's been absolutely appalling, particularly in the last weeks and months around Afghanistan. I mean, it's never been very good on the whole. The media supported the wars, although at the time of in the run-up to the Iraq war, some of the media did turn against the war, really under pressure from the mass movements. And I remember on the days before the demonstration in 2003, the big demonstration, a lot of the newspapers at the time actually carried maps of the demonstration and kind of, and actually some of them, including the Daily Mirror, encouraged people to go on the demonstration. Such was the kind of level of crisis in British society that had been created by Tony Blair and his pursuit of the war. That changed when the war started, and the media took the kind of bizarre decision to say, okay, we thought it was wrong in the build up to it, but once it started, it's suddenly okay, you know, which was a strange position to take and totally illogical, not to say completely immoral. But that's what happened. And I mean, you know, it's been the coverage of the wars have been up and down since then, but certainly now there's a kind of strange repression of any suggestion that it could have been a fundamental problem with the project. That's at the thought here. You know, as you said, the focus in Afghanistan has been all about the nuts and bolts of the withdrawal, rather than actually trying to assess the overall kind of outcomes. And I think that's because, you know, if they did that, they'd have to just accept that there's really no argument here that the whole thing was catastrophic, and they don't want to do that because it goes, you know, it goes so much to the heart of the whole British state, really, which is still obsessed with a kind of global role. It's still obsessed with some sort of, you know, neo-colonial function for themselves. They talk about, the Tories talk about global Britain. They send out flotillas into the South China Seas to try and provoke some sort of retaliation. They're desperate to be seen as a major player on the world stage, which of course they're not. And then you have a Labour Party, which is now, unfortunately, since the anti-war leader was kind of hounded out of the leadership, you have a situation where the front bench of the Labour Party basically seem to be taking Blair's position, which is that we have to defend this idea of humanitarian interventionism, which, you know, I mean, how many more disasters do they need to have? Do they need to experience before they learn some lessons? I mean, it's quite an extraordinary situation where we have an elite in this country that is absolutely blinding itself to what vast majority of people understand as, you know, an obvious conclusion that has to be drawn from these experiences. Every single one of them: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, the support for the war in Yemen. All of these interventions have been absolutely catastrophic in their impact, and yet the British establishment is still trying to defend them. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation, really, and I think it's one that's probably unsustainable from their point of view.
And do you think most people have learned something from the war, if the establishment hasn't? I mean, do you think that 20 years on, most people have woken up to this? And I guess it's a two-part question. You know, when we're talking about withdrawing from Afghanistan and ending the war in Afghanistan, no one's talking about ending the war on terror, which all these countries that you just mentioned were targeted by. So where does that leave us?
Well, I mean, I think the, you know, so-called ordinary people, the majority of the population, as I said, I think they understood it really certainly from 2003. And after that point, at the beginning of the war, there was a slight dip in anti-war feeling, according to the polls. But anti-war feeling again surged from 2004 onwards as it became obvious that what was happening in Iraq was a massacre of Iraqis by US, British and other Western forces. And ever since then, I mean, there's a few moments where things have been slightly different, but ever since then, basically, the majority of the population have been very much against these wars. And why wouldn't they? I mean, this shows a good sense that flows from, as you say, experience. And also, I do believe from the anti-war arguments that the movement managed to promote. I mean, the reason the elites remain blind to what is obvious reality, I think are twofold. One is they can't accept, it would be very, very hard for them to accept how wrong they have been, because that would mean accepting that, the carnage that has been created by these wars is their responsibility. It would mean accepting simple things like there has been, since the beginning of the war on terror, a massive, massive extension in the amount of terrorist organisation there is around the world, which was basically in 2001 focused and concentrated in essentially Afghanistan, parts of Pakistan, and backed by Saudi Arabia. Now there are terrorist organisations on an arc right across Central Asia, right through the Middle East, deep into sub-Saharan Africa. They can't accept this because it would mean they'd have to kind of resign, and just and their whole worldview would be so compromised by this recognition that they're not going to do it. The other reason is that really, the driver of these wars in reality wasn't humanitarianism, wasn't, despite the kind of fantasies of some neoconservatives who did believe that they could kind of refashion whole societies by bombing them. In general, it wasn't about spreading democracy or nation building, etc., etc. Really, what was going on here was the pursuit of kind of power extension, power projection by the Western, by the leading Western countries in pursuit of essentially economic gains and benefits. And so those things, those imperatives are still live. In fact, if anything, and this is the thing that I think we should worry about, that US power globally is more challenged now than it was even in 2001, or much more, mainly by China, but also to some extent, regionally by Russia. So there's more economic competition, and you have this situation where, while China is rising economically and actually rearming fairly quickly, the US remains by far the biggest, strongest military power, and that leads to a temptation under threat and under challenge for them to use military power wherever they can. So I think that's the other and the most fundamental reason why they're not going to learn the right lessons from this, which is why I think continuing to campaign on a mass basis against these wars is so important.
Speaking of continuing the campaign, what are some things that the viewers can do? What can everyone do to help promote and continue and revitalize the anti-war movement as much as possible?
I mean, we have anti-war organisation in Britain in every town and city that we possibly can. We put on regular meetings. We ask people to get out on the streets and petition and I mean, pass resolutions and motions in trade unions, in student unions, in Labour Party or other party branches. Just use every possible mechanism to continue to put the anti-war case and to continue to organise so that we're ready if there is another threat to another country, so that we can get out into the streets very, very quickly. That means we have to have organisation and we have to have the arguments, because one thing that's going to happen and is happening is that the elites always try and reinvent ways of kind of selling war to people, and now we have the threat of China. So there's the kind of constant ideological attack on the Chinese society. They're trying to create more and more hostility against Chinese people, but also against you know, the kind of society that China is. And we have to you know, push back against this, and we have to constantly resist these kind of arguments and say, look, China's not a military threat to Britain. I don't support in any way the regime there. I think it's a very authoritarian and unpleasant regime, but it's not a threat in any sense militarily. And these kind of moves against it are not going to make the situation any better. And we want to push for a world where, you know, foreign policy is based on negotiation and diplomacy and compromise if necessary, and not based on these constant provocations and confrontations. And it seems to me that Britain and the US is really engaged in a massive ramping up of hostility to China, which is very, very dangerous. And our government, you know, we're campaigning very strongly to stop our government getting involved or getting further involved in this process. And they, you know, they're very much, the Tories here are very, very keen to demonize and take on the Chinese. And we've got to do everything we can to stop them.
And Chris, what's the website for Stop the War so people can get involved?
Stopwar.org.uk.
Okay, lovely. Chris Nineham, thanks so much for your time and for coming on. It's such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much.
All right, lovely, Richard. Thanks very much.